Boldwood presents The Ruffler's Child, written by John Pilkington and read by Simon Mattox. Chapter 1. Thomas had fed the merlin early that morning, but now, in the warm September afternoon, she was hungry again. She shook out her feathers, rousing, falconers called it, standing proud on the thick gauntlet that covered his left hand and wrist, dark eyes alert, eager to fly at the quarry. Up here on Greenhill Down there were larks in abundance. He had allowed her to kill several and bagged them up to take back to Petbury. Sir Robert's cook would be glad of a delicacy to garnish tonight's supper. But this merlin, he knew, could take larger game. Thomas had never known one as spirited. Though tiny in comparison with the mighty birds, the sawhawks and goshawks with which Sir Robert and his friends delighted to hunt, she was, nevertheless, a princess among the smaller falcons. He believed she could fly at pigeons now, though they were as big as she. With more training, she might take snipe, or even quail. He had raised her from a squeaky-voiced eyas caught in July and tended her through the long, dry summer with the patience and thoroughness for which Thomas Finbow the Falconer was famous on the Berkshire Downs. He had plans for this little merlin. He would make a present of her to Lady Margaret. She would delight in the falcon as he did, choosing a fine name for her from a book, as was her custom. She would ride the downs with the merlin on her embroidered gauntlet. She might even fashion a jewelled hood for her. Lady Margaret was a gentlewoman with a keen eye for fine things. He frowned suddenly. Did his own desires dare to soar as high as falcons? He, a servant to her husband, he almost laughed at his foolishness. He decided he would let the merlin fly at a pigeon, if one appeared. As he stroked her folded wings with his forefinger, talking softly, she twitched suddenly and lifted a talon. Something had startled her. It startled Thomas, too, for he'd been alone on the hill for hours, expecting to see no one. He heard the noise, an odd sort of shuffling. He turned more quickly than he intended, unsettling the merlin, as something came noisily up the ridgeway below him. There was a shout from further down, and a man's running footsteps. The merlin flinched, jingling the tiny bells attached to her jesses, and Thomas fumbled in his pocket for the hood to quiet her. Then he saw the bear. A great, brindled bear with a manged coat and a slobbering mouth, and a thick, studded collar from which a chain swung wildly about, bounded up on all fours, snorting, and stopped barely 10 yards away. Then it stood up on its hind legs and peered at Thomas. Thomas stood still as a rock, thinking only of the merlin, which was unnerved by the fearsome sight. Expertly, he slipped the small hood over her head, clicking his tongue softly, murmuring in the gentle tones she understood. She quietened at once as he tightened the jesses on her legs and gave the leash an extra turn about his arm. As he did so, a man came hurrying uphill behind the bear, sweating and panting. "It won't hurt thee," the man said quickly, and caught hold of the end of the chain. As the bear turned towards him, the man pulled a bruised apple from his pocket and held it out. The bear's great jaws opened, and the apple was gone. Thomas had been tense as a bent willow. He breathed out slowly in relief. "I ask pardon if he frit thee," the man said, in a thick northern accent. He was recovering his breath. "Ben don't run off as a rule, only there's times he forgets himself." He was a short, stocky man with a dark beard. His clothes were patched and stained from much travelling, though oddly there was no pack on his back. Thomas nodded and indicated the merlin. "There's no harm done. She'll rest easy enough now." He watched the bear, which still stood upright, munching the apple. "It's rare indeed to see a bear ward in these parts." The man shrugged and rubbed the bear's shaggy coat, saying, "His name's Ben Stubbs. I took him out of London, away from the Bankside pit. He were going blind. They'd have whipped him to death." He grimaced. "You ever seen that?" Thomas shook his head. "Heard about it. I'm not one for the bear baiting." He saw now that the bear was indeed poor-sighted. It squinted vaguely in his direction, shaking its huge head. The bearward watched the tall falconer with the soft grey eyes and russet beard as he stroked the little falcon's back. Then he shifted on his feet, looking about him. He seemed eager all of a sudden to be gone. "The road to Wantage. Am I in way of it?" Thomas inclined his head towards the ridgeway. "The path branches east, 1/4 of a mile on. Follow it downhill. You'll meet the road going north." The man jerked the bear's chain. It dropped onto all fours. "I'm obliged to thee," he said. "Now I'd best find my road." As he moved forward, Thomas stepped back to let the two of them pass, but the bearward said, "Oh, Ben wouldn't harm thee. He sees you're a friend to beasts." Then, looking straight ahead, he started off at a fair pace. Thomas watched man and bear trudge across the hill together until, striking the path, they began to dip out of sight. Then he prepared to go his own way in the opposite direction. He was thoughtful. Never before had he heard of a bearwood using the old paths across the downs, but then, since the harsh law against rogues and vagabonds was made more than a dozen years back, men like he had to shun the well-trodden routes. And there were many odd characters about the country nowadays. Migrant workers had been and gone in this year of drought with its poor harvest, the 29th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. His mind turning towards home, Thomas stooped to pick up the bag of larks and slung it over his shoulder. The merlin was quiet under her soft leather hood. He would leave the hood on for the journey down to Petbury. Walking steadily, the bird on his fist, he came down off the Greenhill. After less than an hour, the park, stables and kennels came into view, and beyond them Sir Robert Vicary's great house, lit by the sinking sun. As he drew near to the Falcon's Mews, the lean-to which adjoined his cottage, he heard dogs barking and raised voices in the stable-yard. Thomas took the merlin back to her own perch, where she was kept apart from the larger falcons, placing a little food on the boards for her. He left the bells, varvels and jesses inside, made sure there was plenty of water for the birds, then walked over to the stables. As he rounded the yard wall, he saw several people gathered round a nervous, sweating horse. 3 dogs ran about excitedly, then bounded up to the falconer. He recognised the leash of hunting dogs belonging to Sir Robert's brother-in-law, the unpopular Nathaniel Pickering. Nathaniel, Lady Margaret's older brother, had come to stay at Petbury last winter and become a part of the household. The gossip in the servants' hall was that he had squandered all his late father's money at the gambling tables or the trugging houses, and was all but homeless. Thomas seldom listened to gossip, and did not like to pass judgment on a man, even one as surly as Nathaniel. But he had never been able to like him. Many times he had watched him riding home, the worse for drink, working the curb rein on his horse so viciously that it bled from the mouth. He treated his dogs little better. Now they had gathered about Thomas's feet, tongues lolling. They were more than excited, he thought. They were frightened. One of them had a gash on its cheek. Martin, the house steward, called his name. Thomas walked across the yard where 2 stable boys were trying to calm the high-spirited coursing horse, which he now saw was indeed Nathaniel's. He began to understand the situation. "They've come back without their master, then?" Thomas said. Martin nodded, grim-faced. "I would guess he's had a fall from the horse. But then, why didn't the dog stay with him?" "Perhaps he sent them back." Thomas shrugged at that. "Have you seen any sign on the downs?" Thomas shook his head. "I saw a rare sight, though. A bear with his keeper." Martin dismissed the matter. The grey, stooped old steward, a stickler for correctness, preferred to deal with one problem at a time. "We'll have to mount a search. He could be grievously hurt." Thomas lowered his voice so that the stable lads who had managed to get the saddle off Nathaniel's horse could not hear. Had he taken drink? Martin looked away. "It's not my place to dwell on that, Thomas, nor yours." Thomas sighed. "We'd best fetch lanterns. It'll be dark in 2 hours." Martin was frowning. "Sir Robert's gone to Reading on business. I don't like to assume the authority unless her ladyship allows." Thomas looked over the other man's shoulder. "She's here now." Lady Margaret Vicary, a cloak thrown over her indoor gown, was walking quickly towards them from the big house. Martin turned respectfully towards her. The stable lads stood awkwardly, trying to keep a firm hold on the anxious horse's bridle, but Lady Margaret swept past them, ignoring formalities. "Do what must be done, Martin," she said briskly. "Take the gardeners and the beekeeper. Ask at South Wilby Farm for more men if you need them. Tell them I would beg the favour." "Of course, my lady." Martin hurried off, glad to have things clear at last. Thomas made as if to follow, but Lady Margaret checked him. "I would speak a little with you." He stood in silence while she gave instructions to the boys to take good care of Nathaniel's horse and dogs. As they led the animals away, she drew close to Thomas. She was as tall as he was, and as deep, some said. Her natural beauty and dignity, not to mention her city ways, stunned most of the simple downland folk into silence. They sometimes wondered how Thomas seemed able to converse with her almost as an equal. That she respected the quiet falconer above all the other servants was common knowledge. She spoke to him in the familiar tone she used when they were out hawking together. "When you find my brother, whatever the circumstances, I would merely ask—" She trailed off, watching a flock of crows flying overhead. Thomas waited. "I would ask that you employ discretion." "A man may easily fall from his horse, madam," Thomas said. "There's no disgrace in an accident." "But we both know the likely reason he fell." Seeing her distress, he tried to speak reassuringly. "I'd lay odds he's sitting up against a tree with nothing worse than a twisted ankle." A brief look of gratitude flickered across her face, though her speech remained brisk. "Nathaniel took the south road when he rode out. That was barely an hour after dinner. He seldom rides further than the western edge of Lambourne Downs. Do you know where to begin looking?" Thomas nodded. "We'll find him, my lady, if it takes till dawn." Lady Margaret favoured him with a quick smile, then turned and walked back towards the house. Her step was as measured and graceful as usual, but to one who knew her she seemed preoccupied, beyond the mere likelihood of her brother's taking a tumble from his horse. After all, it would not be the first time the man had gone riding the worse for drink. Dismissing the thought, Thomas walked back to his cottage. When he lifted the latch and walked in, stooping under the oak lintel, Eleanor was settling a trencher on the table. She smiled with innocent pleasure and came quickly towards him. He bent to kiss her. "I must go out, lambkin. I've no time for a real supper." Her 11-year-old face clouded. He put down the bag of larks and busied himself taking off gauntlet and jerkin. "We're making a search for Master Nathaniel. Fell from his horse somewhere. I've come for the lantern." He looked apologetic. "You'll manage by yourself?" She nodded. "Mayhap I'll light the fire. Sit with the mending like Mother used to. I can wait for you." He shook his head. "I'll likely be out all night. When it grows dark, bar the door and get yourself to bed." She struggled to hide her disappointment. She liked nothing better than to sit up by firelight alone with her father and talk until her eyes were closing. In the 3 years since Mary Finbow had died of the sweating sickness, it had become their habit. Eleanor liked to talk about her mother. She seemed to find it comforting. For Thomas, there was still pain. Each year, a little less, perhaps, but the loss was with him every morning when he rose, and she wasn't there beside him. Then he went quickly out, as always, to tend to the falcons. "If I'm not back by sunrise, you must feed the merlin and the 2 haggards," he said, a shade distantly. She knew his moods. She raised her face and gave a wan smile. At such times she was so like her mother, he had to look away. "I got a bag of broken meat from the kitchen this afternoon," she said. He nodded towards the corner. "There's some larks for supper, when you next see the cook." She went to cut some bread and a hunk of cheese, while Thomas found the lantern and a tinderbox. He took down a shepherd's cape from a peg. The clear skies had meant chilly nights this past week. Silently, Eleanor placed the bread and cheese on the table. He ate quickly, standing up as he often did, his thoughts elsewhere. After swallowing a few mouthfuls of water, he was ready to leave. She opened the door for him and waited until he gave her the smile she expected. "Good night, lambkin." As he stepped out and she closed the door behind him, the sun was dipping behind the downs. He made for the stable yard, where a group of men with staves and lanterns had gathered, Martin the steward at their head. Without a word, Thomas joined them, and the party set off at a steady walk, turning onto the south road. Petbury was soon lost behind them in the gathering gloom. They had brought a bloodhound with them and a worn shirt of Nathaniel's to give it a scent. For 2 hours the men tramped the lanes and meadows, searching the south side of Lambourne Downs as the dusk thickened and owls flew silently overhead. They saw nothing. When they first stopped to light the lanterns, there was little conversation. Now grumbling began to break out. "I hope he broke his neck," the oldest of the gardeners said. There was some snickering, but Martin rounded upon the man. "I'll hear no more of that," he said sternly. "Whatever kind of a fellow he is, he's master's brother-in-law and a gentleman." The path ahead of them bent slightly to the left. On the right was a small grove of beeches. Nightjars called in the distance. The bloodhound perked up suddenly, straining on his rope. "Grim's found a scent," his handler said. Some of the men looked about, though there was nothing to be seen in the darkness. Beside the lane was a narrow ditch, but it was empty. "Give him his head," Thomas suggested. The handler untied the lead from the dog's collar. As the rope fell away, Grim trotted forward, nose to the ground. Then he broke into a run. The men followed, trying to keep up. They saw the dog turn abruptly to the right and leap over the ditch. "He's making for the copse," the handler shouted, his lantern swinging as he jumped the ditch. The others followed. The ground rose slightly as they moved towards the trees, the trunks of which gleamed in the lantern light. The handler, in the lead with Thomas close behind him, called back over his shoulder, "He's seen something!" The men came straggling up, the fat beekeeper puffing in the rear. They slowed down as they saw Grim halt on the edge of the beech grove. Whining, the dog backed away. His handler knelt beside him, murmuring, "What's the matter, boy? Don't like the scent?" Martin stepped forward into the trees, working his lantern from side to side. The others fanned out. They peered at the ground in all directions, but saw nothing untoward. "Badger spooked him," someone suggested. But the handler was uneasy. "He's no fear of badgers. Something's wrong here." Thomas walked slowly among the trees, his keen eyes scanning the ground. The grass had been disturbed. Then he saw a dark stain, and further on, at the base of a tree trunk, an unnatural-looking mound, covered with grass and twigs. "Over here," he called, and started forward. At that moment, Grim the bloodhound howled, startling everybody. The others found Thomas on his knees, uncovering a dark bulk. Suddenly, he stiffened and rose to his feet. The men of Petbury stood in a semicircle, lanterns held high, staring in horror at the body of Nathaniel Pickering. He lay face upwards, eyes open, his mouth wrenched into what was almost a grin. "My good Lord," the old gardener said, forgetting himself and making a sign of the cross, for he was of the old faith. But nobody paid him any attention. Their eyes roved downwards. Nathaniel's doublet and breeches were torn so badly he was half naked. And everywhere the blood. His body was gashed in some frenzied fashion by knives or swords or heaven knew what, till it was merely a carcass. It looked a thing of evil. For Thomas, it unlocked memories he kept hidden away in a part of his mind he rarely visited. Memories of a muddy field in the Low Countries, with the clash of pikes and the rattle of harquebuses and the screams of the wounded and dying. When he went as a servant to old Sir Giles Vicary, and found himself a mercenary soldier caught up in the killing of Spaniards. He, a falconer who was en route to Valkenswaard only to buy hawks for his master, had had a sword thrust into his hand and been ordered to fight for his queen or flee from the field like a coward. And he had fought, alongside his comrades from many corners of England who had come to help the Dutch rebels in their plight, and he had hacked and thrust like the others. He had seen men reduced to worse than beasts, slashing at corpses in their rage and bloodlust, leaving many a sight such as the one that lay before him. To come upon it in a peaceful English grove on a soft September night by the light of lanterns sickened him. He pushed through the ring of men, struck dumb in their shock, and stood apart, not wanting to see more. Chapter 2. Sir Robert Vicary had come home late that same night, tired from his journey, and had barely gone to his bed when a servant woke him and Lady Margaret with the news. By early dawn, when the men brought Nathaniel's body back to Petbury and laid it in the small chapel, Sir Robert was in a poor temper, which, on this occasion, he had to curb, if only out of feeling for Lady Margaret. Though he begged her to wait until her brother's corpse had been washed and dressed, she insisted on going to the chapel at once. In the cold room, lit by rush lamps, Martin the steward sat near the body, which lay on a board across the altar. He had asked Thomas to keep vigil with him. They stood up in silence as Sir Robert came in. Their master was a big man, bulky in his fur-trimmed cloak, with thick brown hair and a narrow beard trimmed to a point. He stepped forward and looked down at Nathaniel, taking in the grim sight without a word. But Lady Margaret followed at almost a run, flinging the door aside in her haste. Her gown fell half open, causing the men to look away in embarrassment. She stopped abruptly, her face pale but set firm. She would not weep in front of them. Thomas lowered his eyes, realizing with a sudden jolt that he ached to take her in his arms and comfort her. He closed his fists, digging the nails into his palms until it hurt. This would not do. The tension was broken unexpectedly by Lady Margaret's mousy-haired little servant, Catherine, who came trotting in, carrying a cloak, saying, "My lady, please, you must cover yourself." Then, seeing the blood-soaked body, she screamed in horror. "Get her out!" Sir Robert shouted in fury. Martin hurried forward, glad of an excuse to be somewhere else. He pushed the terrified girl outside and followed, leaving only the master and mistress and their falconer. Sir Robert took a deep breath and addressed Thomas quietly. "Have you any notion how it happened?" Thomas hesitated. An unpleasant theory had formed itself in his mind. On the long walk back to Petbury, he hated to voice it. "There was a bear on the downs yesterday, sir." "A bear?" Sir Robert's forehead creased in disbelief. "With his keeper. It got away from him, at least once. I saw them on the hill. He was making for Wantage, he said." "Would a bear do this to a man?" Sir Robert raised a hand and gestured helplessly. "I don't know." Thomas already regretted his words. The thought of the bear ward being hauled in front of the magistrate and at the very least jailed was bad enough. The thought of what fate would likely befall the bear that he clearly loved was somehow worse. "I don't believe it would." Lady Margaret spoke, startling both men. Sir Robert put out a hand. She took it, though without enthusiasm. "My dear, it does seem likely. There's no wild beast in England would tear a fellow like—" He broke off awkwardly. He was not a man of great tact. Rumour spoke of his being passed over for Lord Lieutenant of Berkshire because, in court circles, he was considered a bumpkin. "I thought not of beasts," his wife said. "There are human devils abroad who would do it and laugh while they did it." Thomas was surprised at the violence of her retort. Sir Robert shook his head and turned back to the falconer. "Had he a purse with him?" Thomas nodded. "Aye, untouched. and his dagger still in its sheath, and his cloak lying not far off. It was no robbery. Though, he added as an afterthought, someone had dragged the body into a copse and tried to cover it with grass. A clumsy concealment. "Then we'll have this bear found," Sir Robert snapped out. "And its master, too. I'll send to Lord Norreys for bailiffs. The man'll stand trial for his crime." "His crime?" Lady Margaret's voice was low. "The bear's crime, surely." Her body sagged as if a string had snapped somewhere. Tears started in her eyes. She turned to leave, then spoke not to her husband, but to Thomas. "My brother was disliked, even hated, here. I know that well enough." Thomas made no reply. "He was a difficult man to love," she added. Sir Robert made an attempt to place an arm about her, but, to his consternation, she shrugged him off. "I tell you, he wasn't always. He could have been a man of science, as our father was. There were things," she faltered, then finished weakly, "matters of which all of you know nothing." The last remark was addressed to her husband. Then she shivered and was gone through the doorway, eyes downcast. There was a brief silence in the chapel, until Sir Robert, somewhat red-faced, turned to follow his wife outside. On an impulse, Thomas spoke, surprising himself with his own boldness. "Sir Robert." The knight stopped at the doorway. "What is it?" "May I have leave to examine him? The body, I mean." Sir Robert frowned. "To what end?" "I believe we may learn more of the matter." He was aware the words sounded hollow, but Sir Robert nodded slowly. "You have the best eye at Petbury, and some knowledge of corpses, I allow." Thomas disliked the edge to the voice, but nodded in return. "I was a soldier, sir, albeit briefly." "Well, look all you want," Sir Robert said. "The crones will come by shortly to wash him." He snorted suddenly. "By the time he's cased for burial, he'll look better than he has for years." Later that morning, having spoken to Eleanor and tended to the falcons, Thomas returned to the chapel, where two old women with experience of such tasks were washing Nathaniel Pickering's body. When Thomas informed them that he had his master's permission to examine it, the women were disgusted, and told him plainly that his actions were devilish, if not blasphemous. Ignoring their complaints, he rolled his sleeves back and steeled himself to the grisly task. Soon enough, his pains were rewarded. Once the blood had been washed away, the gashes on the body were found to be quite shallow. They were parallel and resembled only too clearly the claw marks of a large animal. Most ran diagonally across the chest and shoulders, but there were other cuts in several directions on the belly and thighs. It looked as though the bear, for the bear it must be, Thomas concluded with a sinking heart, had clawed its victim as he lay on the ground. The evidence seemed plain enough. Lady Margaret's brother, at a little over 40 years of age, had died a ghastly death. The bear had probably reared up suddenly from the roadside, startling the horse, which could easily have thrown its rider, especially one unsteady from drink. As he staggered to his feet, it could have attacked him, perhaps enraged by his shouts. Nathaniel was a noted ranter and curser. This might explain why the horse, and the dogs too, had run away, no doubt terrified of the onslaught by such a huge, unfamiliar creature. One question arose, however. What was the bear ward doing during all of this time? When the women turned the body over, Thomas found no claw marks on its back, but there was blood there too. Had Nathaniel writhed about on the ground, struggling to ward off his attacker? But now other questions began to surface in Thomas's mind, the principal one being, how exactly had Nathaniel Pickering died? His throat was not touched, nor his heart, nor any vital organ that Thomas could see. The gashes, though they had caused much bleeding, were superficial. Perhaps, he reasoned, the man had died of shock, suffered a seizure of some kind. Thomas had not the medical knowledge to look for such signs, Perhaps a surgeon should be sent for. Then, as the washing women wiped the blood from Nathaniel's back, he saw the hole. It was small, so that he almost missed it, but peering close, while the other two clicked their tongues in disgust, he pressed down the skin at the centre of the spine and saw it part to reveal a circular opening. Pressing harder, he saw that the wound went deep into the back, perhaps severing the spinal cord. A wound like that could have killed him, and it was not made by any bear. "What now, Falconer?" one of the women asked, but Thomas did not reply. His mind was busy. This was no dagger wound, nor would a sword have made such a shape. In any case, the middle of the back was no place for a sword thrust. Then he saw the answer was obvious. Nathaniel had been shot by a crossbow. Whoever did it was a good marksman. He had found his target, and he had retrieved the bolt. The edges of the wound were torn where it had been pulled out. The elation Thomas had at first felt now ebbed away quickly. The implications of this were grave indeed. But wasn't he forgetting the claw marks? Had the bear found the man dead by the roadside and mauled him? Or worse, had it found him dying and finished the business? Thomas straightened up, aware that his first task was to inform Sir Robert. He was aware, too, of the distress this would cause Lady Margaret. The women had stopped work and were looking at him. "You can finish the washing, and dress him, too," Thomas said. "But there's more to this than I thought. It's a matter of murder." Both of them inhaled sharply. One clasped a hand to her mouth. Without further word, Thomas left the chapel and went outside to wash his hands. It was good to be in the open, with the breeze in his face, but fatigue descended on him. He had had no sleep. With a heavy heart, he started towards the great house. Events unfolded quickly that day. The Lord Lieutenant's men caught the Bearward, not in the vicinity of Wantage, but on the road to Didcot, several miles away. He claimed to know nothing of Nathaniel Pickering, nor anyone else. Instead of taking him to Reading jail, the men were ordered to bring him first to Petbury. The coroner's inquest would be held there, near to the place where the deceased had met his end. Village men would be sworn in as a jury. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Pickering's body, cleaned and dressed in his best clothes, lay in his black-draped coffin, with bunches of yew and rosemary tied to it. Sir Robert was exasperated by the whole business. It was no secret that he had loathed his brother-in-law as much as anyone else, and only gave him a roof because Lady Margaret wished it. Had Nathaniel died after a drunken fall from his horse, or even from a mauling by a half-crazed bear, he would have been more than satisfied to give him a Christian burial in the family sepulchre, issue instructions about the proper period of mourning, then return to normality as quickly as possible. The revelation that he'd been murdered upset everything, and at first Sir Robert felt inclined to blame Thomas. "How can you be certain?" he grumbled, pacing about in the wide hall at Petbury the following afternoon, his shoes scuffing on the rush-strewn floor. Thomas stood before him, his mouth set firm. "I've seen men killed by crossbow, sir," he said, for the third time. "Whoever did it knew his business. An ex-soldier, surely." "But why?" Sir Robert thundered. "God knows Nathaniel was not well liked, but what had anyone to gain by killing him?" Martin, the steward, long accustomed to his master's ways, stood in silence near Lady Margaret, who sat dressed in black beside the huge mahogany table. While her face bore no expression, it was clear that she was shaken by the events. "Thomas is merely the discoverer of the deed," she said finally. "He is not a conjurer. Might he be allowed to return to his duties?" Sir Robert glowered into the wide fireplace, in which a huge fire burned. Outside, the weather had turned at last. Rain drove against the casements. At last, he aimed a curt nod at the falconer. "You did well to find it out," he said, "though I wish with all my heart you hadn't." "As I do, sir," Thomas said, though inwardly aware how glad he was that the bear was not to blame. But, as if he had read his thoughts, Sir Robert said abruptly, "We still need to discover why Nathaniel's body came to be torn half to pieces." At that moment, the door opened and the Vicary children came in. William, now turned 16 and soon to go off to the university, was a handsome youth, with long fair hair and a sensitive face. He had of late become something of a dandy. The sleeves of his doublet were slashed to show yellow silk beneath. Behind him, walking with small, delicate steps in her long black gown, came his sister Anne, 2 years younger, her face bearing evidence of some displeasure. "What is the matter?" Sir Robert was nettled at the interruption. Anne went to her father, who, despite his temper, would deny her nothing, and William to the mother he resembled so closely. "Why aren't you at your lessons?" Lady Margaret asked her son. William tossed his head. "How can I study, with Uncle Nat's death suffusing the house like a bad odour?" He glared at Anne. "And a sister whose sole pleasure in life is to torment me." Anne's eyes filled with tears, and she appealed to her father. "I am the one who's tormented. He mocked my French accent. He said I hadn't the wit of a scullery maid." Sir Robert turned swiftly on William, but Lady Margaret moved wearily to avert the blast. "The death is a shock to us all," she said. "Not least to me, William. I have lost my brother." The youth lowered his eyes. "Quiet restraint is the correct mode of behaviour with a funeral hard upon us," Lady Margaret continued, including her daughter in the statement, "to be followed by a proper period of mourning. I had thought each of you old enough by now to show tolerance." Anne's lower lip trembled. Clumsily, her father bent and kissed his daughter quickly on the forehead. "Your mother is correct," he murmured. "In any case, you should not interrupt your brother when he is studying. But perhaps—" he glanced at his wife, "perhaps studies might be suspended until after the burial?" Lady Margaret gave a nod. "I think that would be wise." A thin, gangling young man in a grey, threadbare suit and gown came nervously into the room. John Pollard, an Oxford scholar, was William's tutor. It was also known that he wrote love poetry, though he neither showed nor read it to anyone save William. He and his charge were close. Sir Robert thought there was something distasteful about their friendship, especially when he saw them sniggering together over some book or other. Now he turned testily upon the tutor, who stood near the door, scratching his cheek, as he was apt to do at moments of tension. "There'll be no more lessons until after the funeral, Master Pollard," Sir Robert said. "You can take yourself off somewhere and scribble." Pollard winced, but stood his ground. "I'm most grateful, Sir Robert, but I thought it prudent to inform you that there is a body of men outside, with a large bear." There were mixed reactions in the hall. William and Anne, their feud forgotten, ran to the windows and looked out, as curious as children of any age. Thomas and Martin exchanged glances. Lady Margaret rose to her feet, saying to her husband, "I will leave you to deal with the matter." To her daughter she said, "That animal is not a fit object for your curiosity. Come with me." Martin and Thomas bowed as she went out, Anne following. Pollard darted aside to let her pass. Sir Robert, Martin and Thomas went to the window and looked out upon a sobering sight. The bearward, hands tied behind his back, standing in the courtyard between two burly sheriff's men armed with staves. Several other men held the bear by a series of taut ropes raying outwards as from a maypole, so that no man was within reach of the creature's claws. Not that it seemed likely to threaten any of them, Thomas thought, with a deal of pity. The animal hung its head wearily, as did its keeper, the two of them standing in the rain, the very picture of dejection. Sir Robert issued instructions to his steward. "Have the bear locked up securely and tethered. The fellow—" He thought for a moment. Petbury was a manor, not a castle. There was no lock-up here. Thomas took the opportunity to speak. "Might man and bear be kept together, sir? The creature may grow troublesome without his master. We could put them in the old malt house. There's no window, and a strong enough door." Sir Robert nodded in satisfaction. "Very well. We'll keep them there until the coroner arrives." Looking out at the bear and his ward, standing on the wet cobbles, the knight's pinched face softened slightly. He turned from the window. William, who had been unable to take his eyes from the curious sight, asked, "What'll become of them, father?" Sir Robert walked away and stood with his back to the fire. "This morning I would happily have seen the fellow..."